Let me just introduce Mr. Ajaya Dixit. Okay, he's a hydraulic specialist also, so he's one of the few pioneering engineers who has been working on water resources in Nepal and preservation of water, conservation of water, and river like that. So he's also a very great writer also. He has edited and written very many books on water resources. I'm sure this session will be very, very productive discussing engineer Ajaya Dixit.
First of all, good morning and how are you?
Yeah,
Good. First of all, thank you very much, the organizers, for giving me this opportunity. My name is Ajaya Dixit. I'm a civil engineer by training and then hydraulic engineer. I've been around for a long time. I've been working for the last 35 years on issues around water. And these days I work around issues of climate change and adaptation in South Asia. Now, when the organizers asked me to come and talk about green future, something about social movement, technology, so on and so forth, I was not sure what I was going to talk. So this morning I kind of Googled you, EcoVision, and tried to kind of find out what you guys do. And kind of gave me a little bit of an understanding. Now, when I came here and listened to your presentation and the videos at the end, where these wonderful people talk about some of the wonderful things that they are doing, I was confident that I'm not off track, because what I'm going to talk will perhaps resonate with you. Because what these individuals talked about is a vision. They talked about future. They didn't talk about present. What was that? Don't trash your future? Yes. It was kind of a millennial perspective. You know, the turtle, you know, the animation of the turtle. It espoused a very different kind of a worldview. The worldview that was very different from that worldview which accepted throwing of the trash on the ocean. We have similar story here, perhaps not to that scale. People throw trash on the Everest, on our mountains, on our rivers. And if you go a little bit south, you see the Bagmati River, which is the cradle of our civilization. It is now stinking, it's dirty, it's filthy. Bagmati is the river. So pardon my sort of, pejorative. A lot of us would like to call it shit-mati, because all the west, all this toilet of Kathmandu gets to that river. So I'm going to talk about role of the civic movement, as you call it, the environment movement like yours. I'm going to touch upon a little bit about what the markets do. And then I see you engage very well with the private sector and the market, by buying the TV channels and so on and so forth. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the governments do. And I'm going to present to you a kind of a theory, a kind of a device that allows us to recognize how these different worldviews, both by the green and social movements, and by the government and by the private sector, how they need to come together, how they need to engage collectively in what we call a balanced policy space. And such a balanced policy space is something that would give us creativity, that would lead us incrementally into the future of improving the quality of life, the well-being of the people, the environment, and so on and so forth. I work on climate change issues, so the lens I'm going to use is climate change adaptations, not mitigation, not other things, climate change adaptation, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of energy. So it's a bit complex actually, green future, social movement, policy, all complexities together, but I'll try to do my best. Now, one of the things, another month's time, all the world leaders are going to get together in Doha. They're going to talk about climate change. They're going to talk about new commitments. They're going to talk about financing. They're going to talk about a whole range of issues. But the fact of the matter is, and that's what scientists tell us, that we are now in a path of seeing an average 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2100. In Cancun, the thought was 2-degree temperature rise. Now, scientists tell us that the continued emission of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere means that the world would face average 4-degree temperature rise by end of the century. Now what does that mean? What would it do? It means for continents, say places like India or Africa or even the United States or Northern Europe, the temperature there would be higher than 4-degree average Celsius, maybe 5, maybe 6. So what would Kathmandu look like if we have 60-degree rise in temperature, say 60 years from now? Not a nice place to live. We all already are polluted, solid waste, liquid waste, air pollution, so on and so forth. Now, to address this issue of temperature rise, human civilization has 3 choices. The first, we mitigate, we reduce the amount of greenhouse gas that we pump into the atmosphere, and that's something that we in Nepal or developing countries do very little, though doing that and having zero emission, like zero waste, is socially, economically and ethically correct. Other one is to adapt, because the carbon dioxide that's been thrown out in the atmosphere over the last 150 years causes what's called stock and flow. And even if we were to achieve the standards set by UNFCCC, we're going to see erratic climate. The world is going to face rising temperature and erratic precipitation. And therefore, you need to adapt. You need to change your strategy to respond to that new reality. And of course, third one is you cope, because you can't do nothing. You have to live with what you have. Just 5% is coping. For China, perhaps same. For Nepal, maybe 5% mitigation, 60% adaptation, and another 35% coping. Now that depends upon where you are and which country you are. And one of the factors that requires us to respond to this challenge of mitigation, adaptation, and coping is to transit to green future to achieve both mitigation and adaptation objectives. But it has many, many challenges. The first, what we see is technological and economic globalization. You see, 30 years ago, I would not be able to find out what eco-vision? Ecozine, yeah, Ecozine or Eco-Action. What this organization was doing in Hong Kong, now I can Google and I can find out. You see, the world is come so together. So therefore, the technological economic globalization is really changing the relationship between urban and rural, developed and developing, rich and poor. So the world is becoming much more closer and connected. And it has its strength, but it also has its challenges. Then of course, other one is this global climate change. The hockey sticks that all of you have seen. The UNFCCC's temperature scenario, UNFCCC's precipitation scenarios, and there are stories about what's going to happen in places like South Asia and Nepal. Studies tell us that in Nepal, the temperature is going to be increasing and precipitation is going to be much more erratic. We're not sure what's going to happen in, say, 2030. Is the monsoon is going to be deficit? Is the monsoon is going to be wet? Is the extreme rainfall is going to increase? Is extreme rainfall going to increase? Now, science and models don't tell us exactly what's going to happen. They tell us that the temperature is likely to go up, but the precipitation, as these graphs show, these scientific graphs, yellow, blue, pink, green, they show scenarios of precipitation from 2000 to 2100 using different global circulation models. They say some model will say rainfall will go up, some will say rainfall will go down. The conclusion, it is going to be uncertain. We're not going to be sure. We need to be therefore prepared for that future. Then of course, you get all these different studies which tell us about, vulnerability. This is a very recent vulnerability index of various countries. As you can see, Nepal is right here, and Bangladesh. showing here in India that Nepal is likely to be the 4th most vulnerable country in the world as far as climate change is concerned. So what do we do? Let me just... So what do we do? What do we do in Nepal? So let's now think about a little bit about adaptation, coping, resilience, all these terms that you come across. If you think of a household, and its well-being with time, this household has some kind of a well-being, sometimes well, sometimes not so well, and then it faces a shock due to floods, shock due to drought, shock due to fire, or shock due to any kind of let's say disaster, and its well-being comes down. Now, if this household gets back, that's one story. I talked about flood. If this household's well-being goes down and it continues in that state, in a lower state of well-being, that is a story of coping, undesirable state. We don't want that to happen. We don't want a household which has a better well-being come down and live in that state. But majority of Nepalis, majority of Bangladeshis, and majority of people in India and Pakistan are in this state. If you think about floods, go to Pakistan, you go to Bangladesh, you go to India, and you talk with women, and they tell you stories about the difficulties that they face. And one story is, they tell us, we as researchers, in the morning, because everything is filled with water, they can't go and attend their church call, because there is no toilet that is specifically designed for them. So they don't eat. That is a very dramatic and serious example of coping a stress. We don't want that to happen. But then unfortunately, our state, our society, our researchers are not able to come out with options or solutions for that kind of reality. That's a major challenge. Now, if that household comes back, to its original state, that's called, I think, resilience. It's resilience, it's robust, so it's come back. We provide some kind of a support, external support, and get it back to that original state. We tell that adaptation. And then, of course, our objective is to ensure that the well-being of that household goes on. It doesn't go down, it kind of continues to increase, and we call that development. So that's sort of a very broad framework, ideal framework that we want to be put in place. Now, after having said that, so what do you do to adapt? If there is climate change, 2 degrees centigrade rise, 4 degrees centigrade rise, flood comes, drought comes, fire comes, your well-being goes down, all kind of problems happen, all kind of stress happens. So what do you do? How do you adapt? How do you respond to that change? How do you respond to that stress? Well, in our work in South Asia over the last so many years, we say, okay, if you have the capacity to switch strategy, you are doing something for the last 20 years, you face a problem. If you have the capacity to switch strategy, then that is ability to adapt. If you can do that, then you can adapt. And what helps you do that adaptation? If you have access to drinking water, if there are no waste, there is transport for mobility, access to market, social networks such as this, the service sector where you can go and work, industries where you can get and employ. That will help you switch strategy. That will help you overcome stress. And all of these, the transport, the market, the social network, the service sector, industries, etc., require energy. Operating this system here requires energy. Operating this computer, this light, this camera, production of these all require energy. And so therefore, question of energy becomes central to mitigation, because you don't want to be dependent on fossil fuel. You want to go to a cleaner energy. Solar, biofuels, not biofuels, last priority. Solar, wind, maybe gas, energy management, demand management, energy efficiency, efficient housing, so on and so forth. So you want to transit to that path where your carbon footprint is minimized. Your carbon footprint of your living as well as your energy system is minimized. So therefore the transit to green economy or green energy. But then it's also central to adaptation, because if you are to help individuals, community, households adapt, you have to have options. You have to have opportunities of livelihood, alternatives. And that you have to have the ability to move to go to work. You have to have access to banking system. You have to have access to credits. You have to have access to whole range of wherewithals that will allow you to respond to the kind of stress, the difficulties and the constraints you face. And that's also central or depends on energy. Now when you think about energy, we need to think about four kind of worldviews. The first is the state, the government agency, .gov, if you will. Okay. Now governments always everywhere talk about procedures. Rules have to be in place. Rules have to be maintained. Law have to be maintained. You have to do this. The government have a way of doing business. There is a secretary, there is a minister, and there is a hierarchy. So governments do things in a particular way. They have a particular worldview of the problem, and they try to use that strategy to offer solutions. And the other side is the private sector, .com. All right? Private sector is substantive. Private sector thrives on profit. That is private sector's dharma, if you will. And fair enough, you provide service and you take benefits. You provide service and you take benefits. You profit. But the profits should not be rapacious. The profit should not be unregulated. Just fair profit for the kind of service you provide. And private sector is where innovation, creativity happens. And private sector, perhaps by working with groups like Green Action, can promote that kind of innovation and creativity. And we see that in different spheres. And then the third category is what we call the civil society, civic movement, .org. So in your emails, it's .org, right? You don't write .com. So those of us who work on environment movement write .org. Private companies write .com. So if you go to government's website, they write .gov. So therefore, three different styles, three perspective, very. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So these very different worldviews. So the important here is civil society, which is a critical rationality, which is a millennial perspective, which is a long-term perspective. The values the civic movements talk about is very, very different from the values of the private sector, the values of the state government. The challenge for civic movement is to maintain its entity, maintain its integrity, while engage the private sector and the state government, state or the government. So the question for us is, how can civil movements become more influential in debates currently dominated by state? If you look at least in our part of the world, the debate is dominated by the state and the private sector. And the voice of the civic movement is very, very muted, very small, very low, and influence limited. So the question therefore is, how can we improve, how can we become more influential in that debate? And therefore the second question is, how can this debate contribute to a more holistic approach where policies transit to green technology or green economy? So just basically highlighting, these three pillars of environment, the biophysical environment in that transiting process, the human-built environment, the symbolic environment. We can think about some of the ongoing global processes, the 72 UN Conference, the 1992 Rio Conference, Earth Summit, and then the 2012 Rio Plus 20 conference, which proposed or propagated this notion of holistic development, the whole role of environmental sustainability, and therefore the idea of sustainable development. And then talk about economic, social, and environmental pillars, and then anything which is economic development and social equity, environment sustainability is what these propose as sustainable development. All right. Now, if I go forward, now given this complexity, given this thing about climate change, and the nature of complexity that we see, you see, we have to go from the current state to a desired state. The current state is the current fossil fuel-based sort of a social system, and we are go to a desired state, which is green economy. And there are very different ways that we can do. So how do we do that? How do we go there? Clearly, we have to learn, we have to change, and we have to adapt. So this whole idea of iteration and learning becomes very, very important in what we do. And the values that we share, these values are very important. And these values are this millennial perspective, that environment has to be prepared, life has to be prepared, equity has to be respected. And therefore, these are the values which the social movements have to articulate and then have to engage with the state and the market. So at the end, if I could take a few minutes more. So therefore, in our part of the world, these three dominant worldviews of the private sector, of the civil society, the civic movement, of which we are part, and then the state government. You know, these are the two actors we really have to engage, because the views of civil society, at least in our part of the world, is very, as I said, lukewarm, low, not very influential. Asking the critical questions, highlighting those points as important, and then changing overall behavior of the general public so that the values of environment kind of becomes your way of life. You know, talking about trash. You know, there was one individual saying, those bags I threw in the trash and I don't use it anymore. So how do we bring about that change? Clearly, the civic movement, civil society can play a critical role in that transformation. And perhaps if I could end by sharing with you, so what's the way forward? How do we do it? One way is perhaps this kind of a meeting. What we need to do perhaps is to begin alliance and among various advocacy coalitions and groups across the world. We should come together with our shared beliefs and value systems that can bring pressure on the government, that can perhaps begin to put pressure on the market, the private sector. Hey, you know, this is not how you do it differently. And then creating that space vibrant and engaging is perhaps one way to think about how to bring changes. And to do that, we need a kind of a global partnership to enable that policy space. We don't talk about scarcity, we talk about rights, we talk about allocation, we talk about entitlement, we talk about equity, we talk about right of the mute, you know, the turtle that we saw. So perhaps by bringing those values together in an international coalition of group like this, and then engaging at the local, at the national, regional, and perhaps at the international level, gives us that space and that voice where hopefully we can begin to make that transition to the green future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your good presentations. Actually, you know that Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable country in the world due to climate change. So you have mentioned here about adaptation, that you tried to say that from the business approach to resolve this climate impact problem, actually that is not working. And now we are doing in Bangladesh, we are implementing some community-based adaptation project, and that project proposal is coming from the grassroots, those who are mainly victims of climate change. And we are implementing this project to show the world that can be work to resolve this problem. And another word you use like green economy. We think our perception is like about green economy. This is totally a vague term of corporates and the polluters to make their black money into green. So that should not be used by us, since we are working for the peoples, and we should not adapt with this vague term sometimes, no. And we also use adaptation like someone is slapping me and I'm okay. So we have to empower people, and we have to increase resilience. So that can be ordered.
Thank you. I think you are right. There is this whole notion of climate justice in this debate.
Yeah.
So therefore, yes, the stock on flow is important. Yes, the global debate, particularly the international negotiation, is going to be acrimonious and is going to be dominated by the powerful players. That doesn't mean that the argument of climate injustice is gone. For a country like ours, which have no role in creating the problem in the first place, this argument has to be repeatedly articulated and highlighted, and then put up in the global debate as an ethical concern. So that's fundamental, no disagreement there. The second point, the green economy. Yes, there is a hegemony of ideas, and that's very powerful, and that's the current reality. But the challenge again is to begin to articulate the voice such as yours, to say, let's look at the assumption of green economy. What are those assumptions? And why is it that we don't accept those assumptions and present alternatives? If that's not so, this is how it should be. And that's the role of the civic movement. And that's not enough for a Nepali or a Bangladeshi to say it has to have this coalition. You have to have this strength. You also need partners in the West. You see, you cannot categorize West as the villain. No, that's not true. There are those in the West which are equally fighting these kind of hegemony, trying to bring about changes in values. So we have to build partnership with those kind of advocacy groups all over the world. In the United States, in Europe, in China, in other places. That's our challenge. How do we build that coalition? How do we maintain that integrity? And then how do you collectively articulate the kind of values that you mentioned? That's second point. And third point, Bangladesh in climate change debate has been on the forefront of dialogue because both as a nation as well as civil society and others have engaged in that dialogue over the last 20 years. So therefore, one of the outcome of the dialogue in Bangladesh is the kind of things you did, the community-based adaptation measures, in which those who are affected, those who are the so-called victims, become part of the design, and then you present it as an alternative. That is the power of what I call the civic movement in its different form. In Nepal, we also have very powerful community-based management model. Community-based management model on forest, on water, on bridge, on electricity, on a whole lot of issues. We have those models that we've been practicing for 30 years. Not from adaptation perspective, but more from management perspective. So therefore, these alternatives models have to be learned and teased out, and then again, through coalitions such as this, articulated in the policy space. And not to deny the market. You see, they are a very powerful actor. You have to engage the market and the private sector. And then, of course, governments are there. Governments are there for monitoring. Governments are there for preparing the level playing field. So therefore, you recognize that these different voices, these different perspectives exist, and we are part of that complexity, and we need to creatively engage.
Thank you so much. I think this was such an excellent roundup of your talk. I wouldn't want to spoil it, really. Thank you so much for your participation.
Much appreciated. Of what would happen 150 years ago was not evident then. But then this process tells us a story, and that story is we should not lock ourselves into one pathway. You see, we must have alternatives. So 100 years from today, when we look back, we should not be in the same trap as we are today. So therefore, in that sense, it's an opportunity for us to begin to rethink about the way we do business. Rethink about our development definition, development approach, our government, our private sector, the international aid, the ODS, so on and so forth. So therefore, it's an opportunity to make that reconceptualization, and then the younger generation is the best place to make that creative inquiry. That's number one. Number two, if we are to articulate these questions, and then engage in that dialogue, perhaps we can go on in that clean pathway. But then if we are inertial, and if we are stereotypical, and if we insist on doing the way that we did 50, 60 years ago, then we go into this other path, which is dirty. So you see, I'll be very blunt. You can't be talking about climate change vulnerability in Nepal, and our government can't go and install diesel power plants when there are other alternatives. That's the kind of a choice that we had to make at this point. There are alternatives. So if you go to these fossil fuel-based path, perhaps we go to the dirty pathway. But that's a challenge and trade-off we have to select.
Thank you so much.